Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and once again it's time for the Q&As, so let's go ahead and get this started with the first question. Alright. Does meal timing throughout the day have a considerable effect on muscle protein synthesis, or are we just talking about milking the last 2 to 3% of gains? Good question. You know what? Meal timing is something that has been massively overhyped. But for people who are chasing that last 2 to 3% of gains at the ultra elite level, yeah, it actually matters. It actually matters. Now, for the average lifter, no, it probably doesn't matter a lot. You probably your pre-workout nutrition is going to have the most impact on your overall muscle growth, your overall energy turnover, all of those things, right? Outside of that, you probably need to make sure that you're getting enough protein feedings through the day, and that would be probably at least 3, maybe 4 that are spaced out 3 to 4 hours apart. But you know, here's the problem we run into with a lot of the timing. The problem is that we don't actually know. Meaning people make a lot of hypothesis. I don't even want to say theories because scientifically they're not theories. There's a lot of unproven hypothesis that have so many variables that you're never going to find your ideal timing for protein. That's the problem. Because we all eat mixed foods, and let's say you go do a study and a study is done on purely protein powder. Well, who in the hell lives on protein powder and dextrose all day? Do you know anyone who eats that as their staple of their diet? So the problem is that it's harder to get research on all these mixed food meals. There is data showing that obviously multiple protein feedings through the day is ideal for milking out the most gains as far as keeping muscle protein synthesis elevated. But there's some studies that show that too frequent of feedings can actually negatively impact this. It's a big, convoluted mess. So the problem is that you're not going to find the ideal. All I would say the best you could possibly do based upon the data is to try to get 3 to 4 good size protein feedings every day. Make sure that you get quality nutrition before you train, and I don't care whether it's your first training session, your second, whatever you do through the day, because some people train multiple times a day. Most of you don't. You know, get a quality amount of carbs and a little bit of protein in with foods that aren't going to cause you to feel bloated or full or anything before you train. And then, you know, make sure after you train you get some quality carbs and protein in. All right, that's about the best you can do as far as your muscle protein synthesis based upon all the available data. Everything else at this point is still so much hypothetical, and it would vary so much from person to person and food to food that you're never going to find the answer. All right, next question. Hey Jason, what do you think about Matt Wenning's training for his bench press? He doesn't do any overhead pressing, but does a ton of back work and tricep work. He says he uses his triceps as the main mover in his bench and lets the pecs and shoulders slowly grow over time from just benching. He has no injuries and has been competing at the top levels for years and has had over a 600-pound raw bench. Big fan of yours. Thanks for all the great content. All right, good question. And I think the point here is that this shows that there is more than one way to skin a cat, so to speak. Pardon the expression. But let's be realistic here. The advice that I give is for the general person, the average person. There's pretty good information on that from coaches over the years. Yeah, doing a lot of overhead pressing can help protect your shoulder girdle on the bench press and can improve your bench press. So we come back to the point of that builds a lot of tricep mass also. Overhead pressing is tricep work. Standing overhead pressing with a barbell seems to have the greatest tricep activation of any overhead press by a pretty large margin on EMGs. It's way more so than even seated stuff with heavier weight. All right, so you are doing tricep work, but it's just about balancing the shoulder girdle. And we're not saying that every person who doesn't do that is going to get hurt. I don't want anyone to think that's what I'm saying. You know, it's possible to not get any injuries doing this. And in fact, people who just build strong rear delts in general, and people who do mostly pause bench and don't do stupid stuff on the bench, generally don't get hurt on the bench press. So what you've got to look at with Matt Wenning, that's fine. You know, you can build big front delts and big pecs using the bench press. So he does extra tricep work. Well, they're still a primary mover. I don't think anatomically speaking or physiologically speaking, it is correct to say that they do more work than the pecs, because they don't, but they contribute. So stronger triceps are certainly going to be helpful for improving your bench. He does a lot of rowing. Well, that creates stability on the bench press. And I hope no one thinks that when I say, you know, overhead pressing and benching, it should be most of your bench work. It doesn't mean you don't train your back. You better have a strong back for all your lifts, right? You need to be doing pulling for your back. And we come back to that other point, since he doesn't overhead press, what's the next best thing he could possibly do to stabilize his shoulder girdle? Tons of rear delt work. Well, if you do 15 or 20 sets of rows every week, and you get really strong at rows, your rear delts are going to be massive and strong also. That'll create stability. There's nothing wrong with this strategy. I just think that other stuff needs to be considered for most lifters. You know, it needs to be considered for most lifters. And I think the overhead press for most of you is going to be beneficial for stabilizing your shoulder girdle. Doesn't mean that Matt's approach is wrong, because it clearly has worked well for him. And there is certainly logic behind it. So let's not say that I'm dismissing what he's saying, because I'm not. All right, next question. I've at a few points in time tried 2.5-inch block pulls and found them ridiculously difficult. Even 50% of my regular deadlift is significantly difficult at this height. Does this say anything about my deadlift? And should I train this movement to bring up a weakness? Yeah, it tells me that you got problems with tightness and speed out of the bottom. You could do these block pulls to work on that, or you could do more deficit work to work on that. Either one will fix that problem. But yeah, these really short block pulls or block pulls below the knee are actually fairly difficult. They're a good accessory. What people need to understand, though, is that doing that is not a replacement for your deadlift. It's an accessory for people who have a weakness there. And that's the truth of it. You're never weak at the top half of your deadlift. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. That's nonsense. It's not possible. Your weaknesses are always going to be below the knee, whether it's right on the floor, very close to being off the floor. Those are where your weaknesses are going to be, and that's what you need to work on if you're going to do accessory work, accessory movements specifically for the deadlift that don't involve just hypertrophying other muscles. Yeah, that's probably where you should focus. Different variations in height, low block pulls, deficit deadlifts, things like that. That's perfectly normal, but keep in mind, you need to ask yourself that just because you're weak there, does that mean that you need an accessory movement? Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe you just need to gain more muscle, more strength, and get tighter. I mean, there's different ways of looking at this, and I don't want to discount that, because there are people who will legitimately benefit from that accessory. Just make sure you're one of them. If you're a 350-pound deadlifter and you're worrying about accessory movements, you're wasting your time. You just need to do more deadlifting and more rowing and more squatting and maybe some power cleans. You'll be fine. All right, next question. Hey Jason, I started cutting 4 weeks ago and I'm eating about 1,900 calories. I also started training legs again. I had to stop for several reasons and lost a lot of mass. I'm now bouncing back quite quickly so far. It doesn't impede my overall recovery. Is training detrained muscles during a cut generally a good idea or not? Thanks, coach. No, it's a great idea, because you're going to get noob gains again and you got muscle memory. The fact that you're gaining strength and muscle at 1,900 calories as a healthy adult male is insane, but that goes to show you how powerful muscle memory is. It's going to work for a very short period of time. You're going to rebound real quick, and then you're going to stall and you're going to start regressing is what's basically going to happen. I'm assuming you're not blasting a bunch of trend. Now, if you're blasting a bunch of trend, you'll be just fine on 1,900 calories. Jeff Side's proven that repeatedly. But that being said, it's going to be short-lived. 3-4 weeks from now, 5 weeks from now, you're going to stall big time, and you're going to need to increase those calories even on your cut if you want to maintain your strength and your muscle mass. So just keep that in mind. There's no free lunch there. You're just regaining old muscle and strength that you had from previous work that you did. It's not free. But yeah, it'll work for a little while, and you should definitely do it. All right, next question. We all as subscribers know by now that if you get strong on pause, bench, overhead press, weighted chin-ups and such, that it's hard to have lagging arms. However, what if you get strong at barbell curls, tricep extensions, doing 135 for reps, for example? Will that guarantee bigger arms as long as we keep progressing on the essential compounds? No, it won't guarantee bigger arms. Now, if you were weak on the compounds, that would sure guarantee big arms. You're not going to do tricep extensions with 135 for work sets and curls with 135 on an Olympic bar for work sets without having big arms. It's not going to happen. But we go back to the other point of Unless you're blasting enough drugs, it can eventually impede your recovery on your big lifts. And it might not necessarily reduce your arm gains, but it's going to reduce your gains everywhere else. Because ultimately, if you're limiting recovery and strength by focusing on these smaller muscles, they're getting fatigue in the connective tissue and everything else, and it starts causing your chin-ups, overhead press, pause bench, everything to stall. Your pecs, your shoulders, your lats, all of that are not going to grow necessarily as effectively because you're not getting as much total overload. So it's not like there's a free lunch here. And the thing that I would say is that I'm not telling you, you should never do these exercises. They have their place. What I'm telling you, though, is that there is zero scientific evidence that I'm aware of, any credible evidence that suggests that doing isolation work in addition to compounds causes additional muscle growth. We've had multiple studies that have tried to look into it, novice lifters, intermediate lifters, scholarship athletes, and the data just isn't supporting it. So I would say to anyone who wants to call themselves an evidence-based practitioner who's telling people these isolation movements are going to add more muscle on top of the compounds, the evidence isn't there. There's some anecdote for it, but when we study it in the lab, it's not being seen. So I'm not telling you not to do them. All I'm telling you is that it may be a waste of time. And is it going to ensure that you have big arms? Yes, actually it will ensure you have bigger arms. What it might do, though, is impact your overall growth depending upon your recovery and if it's reducing the workload you can do on the big compounds. So that's what you have to balance out personally and what your priorities are, because I can't say what your priorities are. Maybe you don't care as much about your lats and chest and you just want bigger arms. All right, well, that's fine then. It'll work. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time in part 2.